Hi, my name is Ruth Westoby. I am delighted to be a part of this conference. I'm pre-recording my lecture in case of poor internet, but I'm intending to be there in person for the Q&A. Thanks to Ferdous Munda for the invitation to participate. This presentation enables me to pick up questions that were inspirational to me at the beginning of my PhD research, which didn't feature fully in my written up thesis, but nevertheless, all my findings relate back to this question. So we're talking about can or did women practice yoga in pre-modern Hatha Yoga? The common sense answer is, of course, yes. Of course, women can practice yoga. We can find plenty of evidence if we define yoga broadly to include philosophy, superhuman capacities, mystic devotionalism, or bhakti, and especially we can find evidence if we cast the net over a long historical period. Then we have the shining examples of Sulabha, Parvati, Lalbhed, and Mirabai, as well as the occasional glimpses of yoginis shining with ascetic power that we see in the Ramayana, for example. There's a lot of scholarship on this. In the time allotted to me, however, I'm going to be quite focused on the Hatha textual accounts. Whilst I think it's important to take these longer historical stretches of time, we do have to extend the definition of yoga quite broadly, and in a way in which yoga does have that capacity to encompass many definitions. So what is at stake in this inquiry? Mark Singleton and Jean Byrne have this great phrase of an anxiety for authenticity, and I would include myself within that category of practitioners in contemporary yoga, which is dominated by female practitioners, of wanting to find within the historical records exemplars blazing a trail that modern practitioners can feel a part of. Yet, when we look at the historical data, we do not get much data on female practitioners at all. I'm going to give you some positive data from textual, iconographic, and ethnographic material before jumping into an argument around the single-sex model of the body that I want to base on textual sources. So this is an extract from my thesis, in which you can see that James Mallinson and Mark Singleton point out that women are never explicitly prohibited from practicing yoga. Jason Birch identifies statements on the universal applicability of yoga to all, including women, in the Yoga Yajnavalkya, and there's some other data on this slide. Lubomir Ondrachka notes the necessity for women in men's practices of sexual yoga, of Vajroli Mudra, and to quote his work, the presence of women in yoga texts continues to be irritating and unacceptable in some quarters, end quote. If we turn from textual sources to iconography, we see here the Mahudi Gate at Duboi in Gujarat that was decorated in 1220 to 1230 and attests to some of the earliest examples of yoga asanas. In this image, you can see clearly a female, but this is more likely to be a siddha, a perfected being, rather than a yogini or a female practitioner of Hatha Yoga. However, also within the iconographic record, here we have widespread representations of the story of the yogini Bahudi engaging in combative and fatal Vajroli sex with the Mahasiddha Kanhapa. This story is told in the Lila Charitra and the earlier Buddhist Charyapada. Looking at ethnography, this is an image taken by Danya Bavalakwa of Rampriya Das, a Raja yogini who practiced yoga from a young age. Yet it's quite difficult to make arguments back in time from contemporary ethnographies, especially if we're going back a few hundred years. So now I'm going to turn from some of those positive attestations of female practitioners to the textual sources. I'm working with Sanskrit textual sources of the early Hatha corpus from the first half of the second millennium. Hatha roughly refers to physical yoga practices. Hatha texts are practice manuals accompanied by limited metaphysics that instruct yoga practice ostensibly for men and preserved within a male-dominated recension history, with fairly in-your-face misogyny. The sources are not systematic accounts of the body, medicine, or metaphysics, and the topics of interest to me are marginal to the sources, both in the sense of being marginal as non-normative and also relying on marginal readings. Consequently, the arguments that I make are somewhat tentative and cannot offer positive injunctions to women to practice or constitute descriptions of women practicing yoga. Where are the women in these sources? Women occur as the butt of jokes or metaphors that turn on their sexual availability or reproductive capacity. As you can see here, a woman of virtue and beauty is useless without a man. The great seal and great lock are useless without the great piercing. We see a similar example here from the Hatha Pradipika. The Vedas, Shastras, and Puranas are like public women. Only Shambhavi Mudra is kept private, like the wife of a good family. Women are ever so rarely addressed as practitioners, but neither are they explicitly banned from practicing. The only instructions specifically directed towards women are in relation to sexual practice. However, I do not interpret the obvious misogyny as excluding women from practice more generally, but instead attempt to read behind it without ventriloquizing the voices of women, to borrow a phrase from Patrick Olival. And I hope by doing so I can say something about the social, sexual, and soteriological implications for women involved in these practices. There are lots of different directions I could go in with my data, such as the gendered teachings on reversing reproduction. However, here I will focus on the sexed body, which builds on the reproductive model. In extreme brevity, the reproductive yogic body is one in which sexual fluids, considered to be semen and or menstrual blood, are raised upwards in the body. A tiny minority of the sources instruct women to raise menses and semen. We have an extraordinary passage on this in the 13th century Dattatreya Yoga Shastra and similar passages in the Hatha Pradipika. I'd like to propose that the Hatha sources ascribe to a single-sex model of the body. Here, the male is the predominant paradigm and the female is the variant. In support of this claim, I'll set out how women are only addressed where genital anatomy differs from male anatomy and indicate the fluid use of supposedly sex-specific terms. An implication of this argument is that women are not excluded from these practices, from other practices. This is an argument from silence rather than a positive attestation. So that was the argument that I'm going to be making here. As an orientation to sex bodies, gender theorists such as Simone de Beauvoir and Judith Butler have argued for the social construction of gender, arguing that gender is constructed through the performance of social roles. Thomas Laqueur's pioneering work Making Sex takes this further by foregrounding the cultural construction of sex. Laqueur argues 18th century Britain went through a radical shift to a model of biological diversions from a prior one-sex model of the body. We can see this one-sex body in Galen, who developed in the 2nd century CE a powerful and resilient model of the structural identity of male and female reproductive organs, whereby women were essentially men in whom a lack of heat meant that their sexual organs had not been externalized. Laqueur provides a fruitful point of departure for analyzing the sexed and reproductive bodies of Hatha Yoga. Laqueur postulates the male as paradigmatic and female as variant, but his work has been critiqued by Helen King and Yi Li Wu from historical Asian medical perspectives. Wu, for example, points to Charlotte Firth's findings, quote, that Chinese medical conceptualizations of bodily gender were too fluid and context-specific to be understood in terms of a one- or two-sex model, end quote. The single-sex or two-sex analysis has not yet been brought to bear on the Indian context. Rahul Peter Das's study is the most focused study of reproduction in medical literature, but does not explore religious or spiritual technologies of inverting reproduction. The following illustration is taken from Das's study. I've lost my images. Prompted by Laqueur, yet with these critiques in mind, I suggest that the Hatha sources adhere to this one-sex model of the body, where men and women are medically the same, with the only variation relating to difference in sexual organs. There are two reasons for this. As I've already set out, women are not addressed as practitioners in Hatha Yoga, except in practices that involve differences in sexual organs, i.e. the Vrajoli practices described in the Doctoral Yoga Shastra and the Hatha Pradipika. The second reason, a fluidity in the gendered specificity of terms for sexed anatomy, softens a strict demarcation of the sexes. Sexual organs are not associated only with one or other of the sexes. To substantiate this second point, we can see that the esoteric anatomy of the yogic body is gendered, Nadis, Kundalini, Shiva, and Shakti, without that ascription bearing on the gender of the practitioner. Yet what of more mundane anatomy? The yoni, as a physical organ, is the womb, the reproductive organ. As such, we might expect the term yoni not to be used in relation to male practitioners, yet it is. Yoni is used as a physical location of the grammatically male body when directional instructions are given. For example, in relation to the paradigmatic male practitioner, the Viveka Martanda instructs him to place the heel at the place of the yoni sthana, and the other foot on the penis, the midra. We see similar in the Shiva Samhita, where the yoni is a site between the anus and the penis, and we find many such examples in the corpus. While yoni is used quite widely in relation to men, we also find penis used in relation to women. The Hatha Pradipika instructs the yogini to use her penis, mehana or medra, to draw rajas upwards. There are fewer examples of women with penises than men with yonis, and of course, we don't have to translate those terms as penis. Some translate them, for example, as urinary tract to make it non-gender specific. But I particularly want to pick on that translation of Medra and Mehana in order to make this point about non-gender specific anatomy. I believe these examples demonstrate that the terms yoni and medra do not refer to sexual organs associated with only women or men. I think this suggests that the nature of the body in Hatha Yoga can be understood in the Galenic model of a single sex. My focus here on genital anatomy might trigger the critique levelled by Helen King at La Cour that, quote, in the Hippocratic tradition, women's differences extends beyond the organs of generation to every part of the flesh, end quote. However, I can't make a similar assessment of my materials because of the paucity of data. As a grammatical aside, we can make a case for the corpus's use of the generic masculine optative singular to include women as well as men. You can see here a verse from the Hitopadesha in which the general rule is given in the masculine singular, but the example is in the feminine. So the patriarchal context of textual redaction, audience, and copying culture could obscure a grammatical universalism. To conclude, I used the limited material on female practitioners to suggest that the sources indicate a single-sex model of the body. This is a feminist hermeneutics of reading against the grain to uncover hitherto hidden possibilities for female practitioners within patriarchal texts. This helps us better understand sex bodies, male and female, with more precision, and the gendered implications and outcomes for both women and men. I have tried to demonstrate that the sources appear to adhere to a single-sex model of the body where women are only addressed directly in the text because of difference in sexual organs. The implication is that women may be considered appropriate practitioners for all forms of yoga practice, but I have no positive injunctions to this effect. Questions that are closely related to this material and to decoloniality are around racialization or caste oppression, and sexuality and pro- and antinatalism. In brief, I would say that references to women are generally accompanied by social and sexual identity formations. Nevertheless, there is no eroticization of sex, and actually very little puritanical chastisement of sexual activity or sexuality. While the attention to discrimination between women based on caste identities is relentless, this is accompanied by a pragmatic or prosaic approach to sex and sexuality. The sources are about men and male-oriented practices. Gayatri Spivak concluded in 1988 that the subaltern cannot speak, and in these sources there is no possibility of discerning the voices of women. Yet, through interstitial reading strategies, we can read against the grain, as Amy Paris Langenberg demonstrates in her work on Buddhist sources. And we can, in the words of Stephanie Jameson, make the text tell us things they don't know they're saying. In my current research, I'm taking these questions forward by researching menstruation in Jainism and in contemporary religions. Thank you.